All right, welcome back to ABA exam review and the continuation of our 7th BCBA practice exam. Today we're continuing with the next set of questions and we're going to break them down together. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. Please like and subscribe. Check out behavioranalyststudy.com for all of our study materials, including our combo pack. When you pass, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. Let's get going. Last year, on average, 5 minutes would pass in between instances of Don's self-stimulatory behavior. This year, on average, 10 minutes pass between instances of the same behavior. What is being measured? We have a measurement question, but made a little more complicated because we aren't asking specifically about our continuous measurement procedures, but more where do those continuous measurement procedures come from? And they come from our dimensions. We have temporal extent, temporal locus, and repeatability. With temporal extent, what measurement do we associate with temporal extent? That would be duration. With temporal locus, what do we associate with temporal locus? That would be inter-response time and latency. And then repeatability is going to be our count, our frequencies, our rates. If you know what continuous measurement is associated with each one of these questions are very straightforward. But you can't neglect to understand we get those continuous measurement procedures from temporal extent, temporal locus, and repeatability. So what do we know from this question? We know last year, 5 minutes would pass in between instances of Don's self-stimulatory behavior. This year, 10 minutes passed between instances of the same behavior. And so the way you can look at it is, what are you measuring? Well, you're measuring time between instances of the same behavior. And so what measurement procedure do we use for instances between or time in between instances of behavior? Well, that would be inter-response time. And we know, because we just talked about it, where does inter-response time come from? Well, it comes from temporal locus. We're measuring a point in time. And so what is being measured here? Well, inter-response time or B, temporal locus. A behavior analyst, while supervising a behavior technician, sets a timer for 5 minutes. The behavior analyst tells the technician to provide attention whenever the client engages in screaming or crying, which is the target behavior. After the 5 minutes, the analyst sets a new timer and tells the technician to provide a tangible for screaming and crying. What is likely represented in this scenario? Let's think about what we know so far. The question is asking about what's represented in the scenario. Not a lot to go on. So let's just say, what do we know so far? We know an analyst sets a timer for 5 minutes. The behavior analyst says, provide attention whenever the client engages in screaming or crying, which is the target behavior. If we stop there and think, why would we provide attention for the target behavior? In what scenario would you want to purposefully reinforce screaming and crying, your target behavior? Additionally, it's another 5 minutes, another timer, and now we're going to provide a tangible for the target behavior. So again, in what situation are we going to intentionally provide reinforcement for these target behaviors like screaming and crying? Well, if we're doing this, what are we likely looking for? We're likely looking for the function. We're manipulating antecedents, we're manipulating consequences, and we need to provide consequences to see the effect on the behavior so we can analyze the function. What analysis are we talking about? We're talking about a functional analysis. More specifically, are we doing a brief FA or a full FA? Well, since we're only setting timers for 5 minutes, going very rapid, that's a brief FA. More often than not, and maybe for many of you future BCBAs, all you'll do are brief FAs. Full FAs take a lot of time, a lot of resources. Brief FAs, given the amount of other assessments you're doing, the amount of time you spend with the client, are often good enough for the purposes of accomplishing your goals. And so when we're only manipulating the consequences for 5 minutes at a time, that's a very brief FA. Now, what about a reinforcer assessment? We're not assessing reinforcers here. The purpose of this is not to identify what we can use as a reinforcer in the future. In the future, if our behavior of screaming and crying is maintained by attention, well, that's what we're going to be looking to change because we don't obviously want our target behavior to continue. So we're not doing a reinforcer assessment, even though we are reinforcing the behavior systematically. And it isn't functional communication training. Functional communication training does not apply here. We're not teaching communication in any form. What we're doing is a brief FA. We're manipulating consequences very rapidly to try to determine what is maintaining a target behavior of screaming and crying. Glinda isn't supposed to have access to any dessert unless she first completes her exercise routine. At home, Glinda's parents keep the dessert locked up, while Glinda always eats dessert when she is at her friend's house, even if she didn't do her exercise routine. The dessert at Glinda's friend's house is what? Let's not go too quickly here. This is a question that should be very straightforward, but if you're moving too fast, you're going to trip up. What is the question asking about? They're asking about the dessert at Glinda's friend's house. We need to focus in on that. What do we know so far? Glinda isn't supposed to have dessert unless she first completes her exercise. So she does her exercise. As a reward, she gets dessert. If she doesn't get dessert. So at home, the parents keep the dessert locked up. Glinda has no access. But when she's at her friend's house, she eats dessert even if she doesn't do her exercise routine. So the question is asking about, and this is where you got to get to the essence of the question. This is where the secret lies. What is the question really saying? The question is really saying Glinda shouldn't have dessert, but when she's at her friend's house, she gets dessert even if she doesn't do the exercise. So what do we call that? When you get reinforcement, even though you're not engaging in the target behavior. Be careful. A, non-contingent reinforcement. We have to think about what non-contingent reinforcement is. Non-contingent reinforcement is a strategy where on a schedule, we're providing reinforcement in an antecedent intervention in a way of manipulating, typically motivating operations. So you got to be careful because non-contingent reinforcement is an actual strategy. It doesn't just mean getting reinforcement for no reason. It's a strategy. So there's a better term to be used here. What about inadvertent reinforcement? Again, if you're describing this without using our lingo and jargon, maybe. But this is the BCBA exam. You want to be using jargon and lingo unless the question specifically asks you not to. And so what you want to describe this as is bootleg reinforcement. Bootleg reinforcement is when someone's gaining or earning reinforcement, even though they're not actually completing the target behavior. And that's what Glinda's doing here. She's getting this bootleg reinforcement from her friend's house. What about ineffective reinforcement? Well, it seems like Glinda's behavior of getting the dessert from the friends is continuing, but we're not really sure about the reinforcement properties here or the effect. So ineffective reinforcement, one, is not terminology we would use, and two, it doesn't necessarily apply here. So the correct answer is bootleg reinforcement. Be careful with non-contingent reinforcement, which is an actual strategy, and something like inadvertent reinforcement, which you might use to explain to a stakeholder, but we need jargon when asked about jargon and asked about our terms. And our terms here, the correct one is C, bootleg reinforcement. Greta is the clinical director for a large ABA corporation. Greta is in charge of creating ongoing training for RBTs on the staff. Greta is specific in her descriptions of RBT requirements. She uses both modeling and performance-based training to teach RBTs the interventions. The last thing she does is monitor RBT performance. What is Greta missing in her system? It seems like Greta's got it pretty down packed. She's got a pretty good system. What do we know so far about Greta's system, and what is she missing? We know she is creating trainings. She describes RBT requirements. She models and uses performance-based training, and then she monitors performance. So remember, when we talk about personal management, personnel training, we're thinking along the lines of how would we train clients? How would we teach clients? And so if you had a client and you described what the client needed to do, and then you modeled the client for the client, and then you gave performance-based training to the client, and you monitor the client, what would we want to do next? What would we want to do after monitoring? Think about it. You monitor, and let's say they're doing what they're supposed to do. The RBTs are doing what they're supposed to do. Well, in order to keep that going, what do we need to do? A, how about a consequence following monitoring? Absolutely. We monitor, now we need a consequence. Either increase and maintain what we monitored, or decrease it. Either way, we have to have a consequence to change that future behavior. What about B, monetary rewards for positive staff performance? So be very careful about a blanket preference, right? Because not everyone's going to be motivated by the monetary reward. Maybe your staff wants more vacation time. So A is much more broad and applicable than B, which is very specific. C, Greta should train before she specifies what RBTs are required to do. You should always make your staff aware first of what is expected of them, and then you train. Those expectations set up the training for success. D, there's a conflict of interest in Greta training her RBTs. No, that's kind of a answer meant to maybe make you overthink this. Greta is the clinical director. She makes the trainings. She can train her staff. It's part of your job as BCBAs and potentially clinical directors is training your staff and making sure they're implementing and performing up to the best capabilities possible for our client's sake. And so what Greta's missing in her system is that consequence piece. After she monitors, how are we going to change or maintain that behavior in the future? After an assessment, your supervisor wants you to help develop a strategy for teaching your client how to restock shelves at a grocery store. The goal is to help your client maintain a job. What should be the first step in your plan if you want to use task chaining and you have already identified reinforcers? Question is asking about your first step in a plan, but they give you some specifics. You want to use task chaining and you already have your reinforcers. So knowing that, what do we know so far? Well, we want to develop a strategy for teaching a client to restock shelves, and we want to use a task chain. Well, what's the first step in task chaining? Well, you have to create the chain. How do we create that chain? Well, we have to analyze the behavior. If we look at A and B, forward and backwards chaining, we're not there yet. We don't have our chain yet. Before we can task chain, the first step is doing our task analysis. Without that task analysis, we don't have our steps and we don't have a chain. Now, what about a preference assessment? Couldn't you argue, well, we need to know how we're going to change that client's behavior first, and before we start doing any skill acquisition, we need to know what they prefer? Maybe, but the question said you already have identified reinforcers, which again is why reading and understanding the question is so important. You've already done that portion. You're done with that. For over preference assessments, we're not quite to forward and backwards chaining. What we need to do is a task analysis. Which of the following answer choices is not a recommended suggestion for a more effective self-management program? Self-management is a topic that we don't speak too specifically about in practice. Typically, people use contracts and that's about it. But really, your goal is to get your client to be able to self-manage. Because when we can self-manage, that gives them a lot more advocacy, one, a lot more independence, and they'll be able to do a lot of our strategies and implementation themselves. So self-management is very, very important. It should be something you strive for with your clients. And so when we want to use self-management, we want to make it as effective as possible. And so in Cooper, they have a list of suggestions that make self-management more effective. This question is a not question. What is not a recommended suggestion? Meaning, 3 of these are recommended for effective self-management. 1 is not. A, self-monitor your behavior. Well, self-monitoring should be part of any self-management package. You want to be able to monitor your own behavior to see your ups and downs, your highs and lows, your progress. So A is absolutely a suggestion. B, recruit a self-management partner. Absolutely. Think about a workout buddy or a study buddy. It's having a partner there to hold you accountable, to motivate you. Always a good idea. C, keep your self-management goals private. We don't want to keep our goals private. You want to make your goals public. And so if you have a client who you're teaching to self-manage, you want to work on a way for them to make their goals public for a variety of reasons, kind of like having a partner. It keeps you accountable. It might motivate you. It becomes very real. So keeping your self-management goals private is not recommended. You want to go public. And then D, contrive contingencies that compete with natural contingencies. You want to make sure in self-management that the learner or person is still getting enough reinforcement, that they're still getting those consequences that can help drive that behavior to strengthen. If the natural contingencies aren't enough, or if they're not powerful enough, or you don't get opportunity enough for natural contingencies, then it's okay to contrive contingencies. Self-management, still need those consequences. It's still very important that the behavior we're trying to teach or change is coming in contact with those reinforcement contingencies. So what is not recommended in a self-management program? Well, it's keep your self-management goals private. All right, thanks for watching. Check out behavioranalyststudy.com for our study materials. Please subscribe for all of our updates, 3 videos a week for BCBAs, 2 for RBTs. As always, let us know when you pass so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. See you soon.